All right, ladies and gentlemen, so this is going to be the second half of the American Revolution Part 1. So it's going to be Part 1B, I guess. And we're going to try and keep this one as short as possible, so I'm going to get right into it. But where I left you was with the British Army bottled up in Boston by about 15,000 colonial militia in April of 1775. And to be perfectly honest, right now the colonists are not feeling particularly British at this moment. So, something else to keep in mind. When you take a look at maps of Boston, both historically and modern maps, they can be a little confusing because the modern outline of the city of Boston kind of follows this red border here. But in 1775, Massachusetts is this blue, or sorry, Boston is this Boston. It's this blue boundary right there, and so a lot of times people get a little confused when they're trying to place themselves on the ground. This is called the Back Bay area. None of that existed in 1775. It was water. And so when we talk about different places, it doesn't look at all, for the most part, anything at all like it looked in 1775. The British stay bottled up in Boston for about 2 months until we're going to come to the next important engagement. This is called the Battle of Bunker Hill on June 16th in 1775. And Bunker Hill is across the river, across the Charles River, which is right down here. Boston is down in this area. And this is what's known as the Charlestown Peninsula. Again, it doesn't look anything at all like this today. But the British decided they were going to go out and try to expand out beyond Boston, get themselves a little breathing room. But once again, because there are so many rebels in Boston, the American colonists learn of the plan really before the English officers learn about it. Almost as soon as the plan is concocted in the British headquarters, the Americans know about it. And so on the night before, the Americans have snuck forward, and overnight they have built themselves a redoubt. A redoubt is an earthwork fort, so it's piled up earth. They make this giant square on top. So the Americans learn of the British plan to move to Charlestown, and they move first and build this redoubt, R-E-D-O-U-B-T, a redoubt. It's called the Battle of Bunker Hill, but one of the curious things is the redoubt is actually built on Breed's Hill, which is the next hill forward. Neither one's a great place to be, and the Americans probably shouldn't be there by all rights. But the British wake up the next morning and find the Americans with this brand new fort, their flag flying over it, and the British, just by matter of pride, can't let this continue to be there. So they send over troops and they attack the hill. The British troops are known, again, for lining up in these great lines. That's the way armies fought back then. And then they would march forward in these masses. And the British indeed attack the American position 3 times. The first time up the hill, the Americans are known, this is where the famous saying, don't shoot until you see the whites of their eyes. The British soldiers aren't going to fire until they're given the word to fire, and usually what happens is they'll come marching forward, they'll try and get the other side to fire, and then when the other side is reloading, they will then charge and attack. Well, what happens is the Americans let the British get so close before they fire the first time that when they do fire, they absolutely devastate the British lines on the first time up, and the British Army tumbles down to the bottom of the hill. This is a famous picture about the second wave going up the hill. You can see the British soldiers marching past the bodies of their comrades who were hit the first time going up. They get up to the top, and the Americans do exactly the same thing to them again, and they just fire and blast away. Another picture of the battle, this one from the time period, the British fleet shelled or bombed the town of Charleston. The British were convinced that gunfire was coming from the town, so the British fired cannonballs, heated cannonballs designed to make wooden buildings burn, and they fired them into the town, burned the entire town. The town lays vacant until the end of the war. And you can see once again the British Army marching up the hill, trying to get up to the top right there. And finally, indeed, on the third attack, now the Americans have run out of ammunition, and the British are now really angry. And of course, you can imagine when they get to the top of the hill, the bloodbath that ensues. This is a very famous painting called The Death of General Warren. General Warren is a very famous colonial leader. It's painted by a guy from Connecticut. His name is John Trumbull. He's a very famous painter from the late 1700s. And on this third attack, the British capture the redoubt, and the Americans are sent back off. The aftermath of the battle, in terms of casualties, it is a huge American victory. The Americans lose 115 killed, 305 wounded, a total of 405 casualties. The British Army loses 226 killed, including 19 officers, and 828 soldiers, including 62 officers. They lose 1,000 troops to the Americans' 450, so about at least more than a 2-to-1 loss. The British win officially because they're the ones in control of the land at the end of the battle, but it's an incredibly costly victory. And as a matter of fact, the British Army back in London says a few more victories like this and we'll completely wipe out the British Army. The British people, as a matter of fact, poke fun at the entire affair. They're poking fun at their own army by creating this cartoon right here. It's called Bunker's Hill in America's headdress. And women of the time period, actually, when they got all dolled up, they would put these elaborate head pieces, hair pieces, up. They would literally build these structures on top of their head. And in this particular one, America, portrayed by this woman here, is going off to a ball, and she has the entire Battle of Bunker Hill up here on top of her head. This is an English cartoon poking fun at the British, who got devastated so badly. Bottom line is, at the end of the battle, yeah, the Brits might control Bunker Hill, which is right here, but they really don't control anything else, and essentially nothing has changed. The Americans aren't strong enough to force their way into Boston, and at this particular point in time, the British aren't strong enough to force their way out of Boston, and we are stuck again. Interesting note, George Washington was made commander of the Continental Army 2 or 3 days before the Battle of Bunker Hill. The battle actually takes place, I think, on the 17th. And so he is down in Philadelphia just getting command of the army. He doesn't know the Battle of Bunker Hill has taken place. The people up in Boston don't know that George Washington's been made the commander of the entire Continental Army. And all of this stuff takes place while Washington comes up. He arrives in the very beginning of July to take command of the Continental Army. George Washington is absolutely stunned by what he finds. There's just total mayhem up there. There's virtually no ammunition. Supposedly Washington is so stunned by what he's seen, he sits down on a barrel for an hour just totally speechless, unable to respond. But he very quickly gets control, starts passing new orders, and starts the first steps to getting these soldiers, the militia, who, by the way, have now been transformed overnight by an order of the Continental Congress. All these militiamen have now been made the Continental Army, and he starts to transition his soldiers into a true army. But we continue to be stuck and stuck and stuck, and nobody can figure out what to do until along comes a guy by the name of Henry Knox. He is eventually going to be a general, and he's eventually, down here, he's going to become Washington's chief of artillery. Before the war, Henry Knox is a Boston bookseller. He knows nothing at all. He's never had any military experience, but what Henry Knox loves to do is he loves to read books about military topics. And as such, Henry Knox actually knows more about using artillery than any other colonist or any other American. He knows that the Americans captured out in eastern New York an old French fort called Fort Carillon that was built during the French and Indian War. He knows that the British had captured it, taken control of it after the French and Indian War. He knows the Americans had just captured it, and he knows there's a lot of big, heavy cannon out here in Fort Ticonderoga. So he proposes a plan to bring the cannon from Fort Ticonderoga to Boston in the winter time. We're getting on to winter in Boston. And so Henry Knox rides out in November, rides from Boston, Cambridge area out to New York, and he arrives in very early December, and they load up cannon. From December 6th through January 24th, Henry Knox and his men load up 59 cannon, and they haul them overland from Fort Ticonderoga, New York, all the way down what is today considered probably the Massachusetts Turnpike. They think that's what the route that he took. And they haul it down there, and he arrives outside of Boston on the 24th of January with 59 cannon. And so now Washington finally has the weapons he's going to be able to use to force the British out. But now they got to figure out the next plan, and that's how to use them. That happens in March of 1776 when Washington fortifies a place called Dorchester Heights overnight. Dorchester Heights is on the south side of Boston, and they do it overnight by building lots of these wooden baskets, large, huge wooden baskets, and they would haul them up to the top of the hill and then very quickly put shovelfuls of dirt and fill them up with dirt, and overnight you've got this giant fortress. They start hauling the cannon up there. When the British wake up the next morning in Boston, they suddenly find an entire American fort full of cannon way up on top of this hill. And they know that if they try to do another frontal attack, they're going to have another Bunker Hill. They're going to get wiped out. And so what ends up happening, is on March 17th, 1776. The British Army evacuates Boston and sails away to Halifax, Nova Scotia. The following day, the Americans move into Boston and they take command of the city. And this actually is still called Evacuation Day. It's a big holiday in Boston. And the British Army has now left. And this actually ends what historians often call phase one of the war, and actually ends most of the fighting that takes place here in the New England area. There are some notable exceptions right here in Connecticut that'll take place later in the war, but we'll talk about them a little bit later. The end of part one. Go back, make sure you've listened to the notes, make sure if it's written down here that you've got it copied into your notes, and we'll see you on the next video, okay? Take care.